We've all been there, right? We watch an amazing original movie or play a fantastic new game and we think, wow, I want more of that. More of that character, more of that world, more of that story. But when the time finally comes for us to get back into the narrative, something feels a little different. For one reason or another, the sequel somehow never lives up to the hype of the first, and some are just outright blasphemous to the whole message and character progression we got in the original. This is the sequel trap, and it's plagued stories across films and games alike, ruining entire franchises in what seems to be one big, unavoidable mess. Why has this happened so often? And how much money do I need to spend to be able to get one goddamn good sequel? Okay, sorry. And how can writers avoid falling into these pitfalls over and over again? There are many reasons why it's so difficult to write a good sequel, but the core issue is with how sequels tackle character development. In a typical new story, characters often commit a horrendous mistake due to some kind of character flaw. This is what sets the whole plot into motion. Think Simba indirectly causing the death of Mufasa, his dad, or Kratos being tricked by Ares to murder his own family. Actually, I guess the inciting incident doesn't have to be someone's death, but those are just the ones that came to mind. Let's try this. Lightning McQueen from Cars. He starts off the movie as an arrogant, ego-driven race car who doesn't care about anyone but himself. He decides to force his driver Mac to go on the road overnight in an attempt to get to California first before his competition. This ultimately leads to McQueen being stranded in the middle of nowhere, Radiator Springs, where the rustic community shows him that there's more to life than just racing and winning. In the gripping climax where McQueen is one lap away from winning the Piston Cup, a trophy that he's wanted his entire life, he chooses to give it all up to help his competitor, the King, finish his last race with some dignity after the King wrecks out. This is his redemption moment, where McQueen overcomes his character weakness and shows himself in the world that he is a better man, Carmen, and that he has changed for the better. From a plot standpoint, that arc has completed nice and neatly, at least when it comes to McQueen as a character. So what happens when the writers need to come up with a plot for the sequel? Well, to follow conventional self-contained story writing, you need to introduce a new flaw and a new goal. One that will cause and lead to the same kind of character development that we got in the first one. But now, because it's a sequel, there are a ton of restrictions that you have to think about. First, not regressing the development of the first movie. You can't have a character overcome arrogance and have that be the exact same issue that they deal with in the sequel. You also have to interleave the existing characters into the sequel story as well. Maybe the side characters that you created for the first story wouldn't be great matches for the second, but you can't remove them from the story without having a good explanation for why they're not in the movie anymore, or else it's quite obvious that there's a huge hole left behind from their presence. And obviously, you can't keep all the same characters. You need to introduce new ones to keep up the intrigue and potential new relationships with each of the main cast. This is all not even mentioning the new overarching quest that the characters need to go on to make sure that their actions make sense when expanding their world. Somewhat paradoxically, if the original story was a good film, that usually means that most, if not all, the loose ends from the story were tied up already, and there would only be a few open-ended questions left for the sequel to build on. This is why you see so many characters that are orphans or have missing single parents, because this is the easiest save it for a rainy day plot point that doesn't need to be addressed immediately and can be used for a sequel. I'm looking at you, K-pop demon hunters. And herein lies a few of the traps that sequels have to navigate. A lot of ways to escape these traps is to treat the second installment like it's the first in the series, carefully tiptoeing around if needed. There are many ways to do this, some good, some bad, but definitely necessary to keep the narrative fresh. One extreme example is to replace the main character altogether. This, in my opinion, is one of the craziest ways to try and get around the character issue, but with a new character, we can introduce them with the right flaws that work for the story at hand, rather than try to retrofit something onto an original character that wasn't going to work in the first place. Sadly for Cars 2, they tried this by making Mater the main focus of the second movie, with Lightning actually being pushed aside for some reason, but this flopped in more ways than one, turning the movie into a strange, goofy spy adventure with no real character development for either of those characters. Unpopular opinion, this movie isn't terrible as a standalone spy movie with Cars spin-off, but while this works for extra side stories that don't have overarching plot lines, this works terribly for a sequel movie that relies on nostalgia and continued character progression from the first movie, when it didn't even feature McQueen for no real reason except they wanted to put Mater in there. Cars 2 definitely came up short when it came to other areas of the story as well, like why is Doc Hudson dead? I mean, I actually know why, because the voice actor, but why is the main plotline spy cars instead of more racing? And seriously, the all-in-oil Axelrod twist? I don't get it. Well, that last one isn't really related to the sequel portion of it, and it's more of just a plot gripe. You know what I mean. On the other hand, games like Hades 1 and Hades 2 use this method successfully to keep the gameplay loops intact, while also giving us a good reason for why the underworld is reset, with all of our weapons and skills back to the original form that we had, with new characters and new weapons. This is done by replacing our main character Zagreus from Hades 1 with his younger sister Melinoe. This only works because they introduced her in a way that made sense narratively, since she was literally born after Zagreus reunites his family in the conclusion of the first game. It also explains why we're in a familiar place, because when the rest of her family is gone and captured, she too needs all the powers of the gods to help rescue them, just like Zagreus did to defeat Hades, with of course all the changes that beget a sequel due to how much time has passed and the new villain Kratos taking over and changing things. Now another, simpler method than replacing the main character is just introducing a new flaw or new situation. This has to be something natural, like a new dynamic that introduces the flaw, rather than just suddenly changing the character's personality. Good examples of this include Incredibles 2, where Mr. Incredible is trying really hard to use his brains, not his bronze, to take care of his kids, while Mrs. Incredible goes out and fights for the rights of supers as the face of the new superhero initiative. There's also Zootopia 2, which I highly recommend you go watch if you haven't already, where Judy and Nick become official partners on the police force, and have to learn to navigate that relationship while making sure they do their job effectively. In these cases, the new situations bring up new flaws that weren't evident in the first film because there was never an opportunity for this to rear its ugly head. This technique has its own set of drawbacks though, as it's a fine line balancing realistic scenarios that don't feel overly exaggerated with enough change that feels like it's not overturning the world that it was built on. One of the worst crimes when trying to implement any of these is character regression. Even when putting characters into a new setting, this shouldn't take any character backwards from where they ended up in the first installment. Examining Mr. Incredible again, he actually ends his arc in the first movie by coming to terms with the fact that the glory days are over, and instead of trying to relive the past, he should focus on the present and being with his family, who matter most of all. In the sequel, however, we see him struggle with this exact same problem when his wife is chosen to be the face of superheroes, and he gets jealous of his wife's position while he has to housewife at home. This kind of dissonance often ends up being more of a weird feeling than something that sets off red flags, but add enough of these out-of-character moments together, and they can stack up pretty quickly. Another consideration to the main characters are the side characters, who can make or break a sequel as well. Some movies choose to churn out all the side characters and give us a completely different cast to work with. This can be done correctly if there's a reason that this makes sense, but if done like Kingsman 2, The Golden Circle, where all the Kingsmen except the main cast are literally just blown up rather than developed more into real characters for no obvious reason, we feel like there was no point in having them as background characters in the first place if they were just going to disappear by the second. Ideally, this is supposed to be a great opportunity to build on side plots and bring more depth to star side characters that came out from the first time they appeared. For example, Brock and Sindri from God of War, Ragnarok, who played major supporting roles in the first one and even bigger ones in the second, with their relationship in the first game being expounded on in the second. If you know, you know. The last major factor for a good sequel relies on the plot continuation. While a story can fail in many ways, even if it's not a sequel, it's especially hard to get right when one journey has already concluded and we're trying to open up the world for a new one that would make sense for their next challenge. Writers can certainly dig themselves into a hole here, as let's say that the previous movie or game ended with the main characters saving the world. Where are you supposed to go from there? If you're familiar with the Dragon Ball Z series, you know what I'm talking about. We literally skip from numbers to colors at this point because we've had to up the stakes so much, and we're on Galaxy 15 after saving the planet like 100 times. That's because traditionally, a sequel wants to create a bigger goal for the cast to tackle now, once they've already accomplished a lower level goal. I think you can understand why it'd be a bit disappointing if we went from saving the planet to saving, I don't know, someone's store. The second issue is with planning, and actually leaving threads for a sequel to pick up from. If you do not plan a story with any forethought into where the ultimate journey will end, it's highly likely that you'll be left grasping for straws when trying to sow the seeds for a new sequel. This isn't, of course, encouraging writers to leave a bunch of questions unanswered, because that would be a terrible path to go down as well. FNAF. But it does give more options for a sequel to go down if you're planning these threads out correctly. This is a common issue that I see in many sequels, but it's also one of the most forgivable because we just need to suspend a tiny bit of belief so that we don't get caught up in the semantics of why certain things didn't happen and these elements of that story. Finally, if the world itself is limited in some way, either geographically or population-wise, it's hard to add something new without feeling like these people or places should have existed in the first place. Zootopia 2 had this problem with the city geography fully covering the 4 main zones in the original and having to make a point of explaining why certain areas and people were not really part of the original introduction to Zootopia. Once again, no spoilers, go watch it. To just list some other issues that may come up for sequels in this department, sequels that are basically carbon copies of the original, sequels that keep using cringy callbacks that don't really add anything of substance, or sequels that just write off certain characters and certain important figures without much explanation. Now, there are a ton of media that do navigate these obstacles well when creating a sequel. But even for them, it's unlikely that they'll ever exceed the success of the first. Like I mentioned before, originals are often written very tightly and on very specific premises, something that a sequel does not have much leeway to do. Similarly, something that I plan to talk about in a future video is that sequels are often utilized as an Act 2, which can be challenging for writers who need to consider new viewers who haven't seen or played the originals, as well as old viewers who don't want to get bored with the whole exposition again. It's a challenge to balance this from every possible angle and still come out with a succinct and compelling story on the other side. Some examples of good sequels, like I mentioned already, are God of War Ragnarok, Hades 2, Zootopia 2, and one I'd like to call out specifically, Puss in Boots 2. Yeah, you heard me. Now, especially with this movie and the other sequels that I just called out, they all do a good job at improving the narratives they started from, without losing the voice that they developed over the entire story. Puss in Boots 2, The Last Wish, actually takes the clever concept of a cat having 9 lives and having Puss be afraid of losing his 9th life. It makes perfect sense why we don't have this plot point in the first movie, because he still had lives to work with at that point. The new villain being Death also is a brilliant move that plays on Puss's ego and arrogance that was always a bit a part of his character. Even old characters were brought back with a little bit of a change in their dynamic, like Kitty, who was left at the altar by Puss, who we see had a fear of commitment. In the climax, he decisively declares that while he could never beat Death, he would never take for granted the life that he has now, unlike how he did in the past, giving us a satisfying conclusion to his character arc. These kinds of examples show that it can be done, and while it's not easy, with the proper care and organization, the sequel can do justice to the original. So all in all, it's kind of like walking through a landmine that you put in place yourself, creating the original work. Thankfully, while rare, it's been done exceptionally well before, and I hope it'll continue to be done even better in the future. Which sequels do you guys love? Which do you hate? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, sprinkle in some evidence using some of the traps that you learned from this video or ones that I didn't even mention. Thank you all for watching, and keep an eye out for more.